Hey everybody, this is So Heidi, and you're listening to the Successful Fashion Designer Podcast. We all know that the fashion industry is brutally competitive and it takes loads of hard work to get ahead. The problem is that everyone's secretive and tight-lipped about their ways. After working as a designer and educator for over a decade, I wanted to help break down those barriers and bring you valuable knowledge from industry experts, and this show is exactly where you'll find that. Whether you're trying to break into the fashion world, make yourself more marketable, launch your own label, or become a successful freelancer, we'll help you get ahead in the cutthroat fashion industry. This is episode 26 of the Successful Fashion Designer Podcast, and today I have a really fun guest on. This is Liv Secret, and she's different than any other guest that I have had on. The reason is because she doesn't actually work in fashion, but she writes about fashion for Fast Company. If you've not heard of Fast Company, they're the world-leading progressive business magazine. Liz covers so many great stories about what's going on in the industry, and she has such an interesting perspective from the hundreds of interviews that she's done of various industry professionals, startup brands, and all sorts of amazing people working in fashion. In this week's episode, I turned the tables on Liz and interviewed her. In our chat, she shares her interesting perspective on workplace and retail trends, what that means for consumers and industry professionals like you and me, and how millennials have affected the shifts that we're seeing right now in the fashion industry.
Now that the industry is saying, actually, this culture of exclusivity is not really working for us. We want to be more inclusive in terms of how we approach our consumer. I think that inherently forces them to be a lot more inclusive and about their hiring practices and about how they treat their own people.
Before we jump into the interview, I have a quick favor to ask. If you enjoy this episode, one of the best ways you can say thank you and give back is by subscribing and reviewing the show on iTunes. It only takes a few seconds, but this small effort really helps the show grow and get discovered by more listeners. Visit sfdnetwork.com/subscribe to do that now. Thank you so much. I'd really appreciate it. To access the show notes for today's episode, visit sfdnetwork.com/26. Now on to the interview with Liz. Well, welcome, Liz, to the Successful Fashion Designer Podcast. I would love to have you start out by introducing yourself to everybody and let us know a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Liv Secret. I am a staff writer at Fast Company magazine. It's a progressive business magazine that covers all the latest and coolest startups and companies doing really innovative things. And my area of focus at the publication is fashion. So I get to stay on top of all of the latest things that are happening in the fashion world. And I spend a lot of time looking into the really awesome startups that are popping up in this space. So I think that we're going to have a lot of fun things to talk about.
Yeah, super cool. Okay, so I want to get to the startups, and I have that sort of in my notes. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the article that actually prompted me to reach out to you. So this was an article published a couple months ago, maybe. I don't see the date on it, but it's called Drugs, Wage Theft, and Boob Tape. Here's what it's really like working in fashion. And this article, I shared this with my audience, and it got a lot of reaction. I would assume you got a lot of reaction on your side from this. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that article, and I'll link to it in the show notes so everybody can read. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about some of the discoveries you made going through that article and like what it is really like working in fashion.
It's so interesting because when I started researching and writing stories about the fashion industry, the first thing that you hear about, and I think what the average consumer or the average person who buys clothes sees, is all of this creativity and all of this amazing, all of this amazing innovation that's happening in the industry, and that's sort of where people, that's what people perceive about the industry. When I was researching and doing stories, I would sometimes talk to people who would mention things about how difficult and tough the industry was. And it was never very overt, because often I'd be talking to people who were still working in fashion, who were still working in fashion, or who, or who didn't want to speak too badly about their employers. But there was always this undercurrent that things were like not quite right. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to investigate this, and I'm going to reach out to my base and ask people to share their stories with me off the record, or, you know, without having to use their names. Mm-hmm. And suddenly I got this like massive outpouring. Like, so many people reached out to me and wanted to tell me all kinds of stories. The average story was about a young person who had all these dreams about working in fashion and started in the industry. And there were a couple of things that were very obvious. One was that they wouldn't get paid. This is an industry that often, brings in young and impressionable, workers, and it doesn't pay them. For a while, it wasn't paying them at all. So interns weren't making any money. Mm-hmm. That changed a little while ago when legislation changed. But still, I mean, we're still talking about people who are entering the industry and getting paid something like $12 an hour, which is just not enough to live on in New York.
Yeah.
So that was one element of it. But in addition to the very low wages, there was this culture of abuse. And it was very consistent. There were these older, more established people in the industry who were very creative and had a lot of power. And it was very typical for these people to treat their underlings as disposable and to treat them just very poorly. So to verbally abuse them, to expect them to work around the clock, just none of the qualities that of culture, of workplace culture that we're seeing in other innovative industries like technology, where, you know, there's at least this conversation that's happening about, like, how do we make the workplace a comfortable one for our employees. That conversation just was not happening in fashion. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, it was a tough read, I won't lie, but I love that you don't sugarcoat it. You really just come out, and it's this absolute transparency and this absolute honesty of, like, what's really going on behind the scenes in the industry. But you mentioned that there's signs of hope. And so one of the things I'd love to talk about with you today is, you know, you've been covering fashion for 5 years? What about timeline?
No, it's about 2 years now.
2 years. Okay. My apologies. I looked at something different. But so these signs of hope, like, one of the overlying things I want to touch on is, you know, what have you seen in the 2 years that you've been going through all these interviews with these different companies? And so I think we can look at it in a couple different ways. We can look at it. One is, like, there's this whole startup culture, which is growing and growing and growing. And we're seeing more and more of these smaller indie designers, these startup designers, breaking into this industry. And so what have you seen in terms of shifts between some of the startup designers, some of the more established brands, where, from what I've heard in my experience, is where some of the worst abuse goes on is some of these bigger name established brands. I don't think we can say that as a blanket statement, but I think those are some trends that I at least see. And so what are you seeing in the past 2 years of your experience? Any shifts in what's going on in this abuse and maybe these signs of hope for these designers?
Yeah, one big thing that happened was lots of these interns that were not getting paid, and they were working for fashion magazines and fashion brands, spoke up, and they started bringing lawsuits to these employers, which was kind of a big deal, because it was the first time that had happened in the fashion industry, and that, you know, it made it got a lot of press. And it also helps to change the way that these businesses operate. So now fashion brands need to pay interns. And that's just one aspect of it. I mean, I think it was basically drawing attention to how these businesses were sort of not treating their entry-level employees very well. And so I think that it started a larger conversation about that. So I think that that's one thing. And that's that, younger employees, millennials and Gen Z, they're not just sort of accepting the status quo. And that's really important, because I think that part of what had been going on in this industry is that, you know, it's a relatively, old and established industry, right, in the United States. And the brands that these young women were working for, most of them young women, these brands that they were working for, they've been around for a long time. There are these patterns of behavior that were at work. And so to have a generation come in and say, no, we're not going to accept this, I mean, that's one important thing that happened. But there's also kind of these other things that are happening. One is that the industry is sort of changing its approach to things like beauty. And so, everybody's aware of this, but for a long time, fashion brands didn't really want to have anything to do with the plus size market. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing this big shift that's happening now where these brands are now opening up to trying to be more inclusive about the clothes that they're making. And I think that is actually related to the way that the industry treats their employees, because there was this culture in fashion where, everything was so much about exclusivity, right? It was that the people that they would hire, how attractive an employee was, all of these things were just part and parcel of working in this industry. It was an industry where, a lot of employees that they brought on were wealthy because the only people who could afford to work for nothing, came from families that could support them. Mm-hmm. There was this culture of only hiring, model-esque people, and all of that, right? And so now that the industry is saying, actually, this culture of exclusivity is not really working for us. We want to be more inclusive in terms of how we approach our consumer. I think that inherently forces them to be a lot more inclusive and about their hiring practices and about how they treat their own people. And so I think that the combination of those two things is giving some people in the industry hope that, change could be, on the way.
Yeah. And so what do you see happening within some of these startups and some of these younger, more progressive companies in terms of this inclusive, exclusive when it comes to their employees and how people are being treated?
I think that's the place where I'm most hopeful. Mm. So, for one thing, startups are actually having a much bigger place in the market than several years ago, I think. The big established brands some of them are struggling, right? I mean, you think about several years before I wrote this article, I also wrote another story about how, the big American brands like Tommy Hilfiger and Ralph Lauren and Donna Karan, these brands that are sort of established and have been around for a long time and had enormous employee bases, those brands are sort of struggling to keep up. And what that's doing is that's creating space in the market for all of these really cool, innovative startups that are really small, that are trying to approach the fashion industry differently. It's giving them space and room to breathe and to do interesting work. And so in terms of, workplace culture, I think that these younger designers do have a totally different approach. Part of it is just that they're younger, so they're from, the millennial generation, and mm-hmm. so they tend to be more, they tend to have a different approach to the workplace, and in a lot of the data we're seeing, millennials have different values when it comes to working. They really want their jobs to be places where they're happy. That's a really important value to younger employees. And so with millennials at the helm of these companies, I think there's just an inherent concern about workplace culture that just isn't true for more established companies. Mm-hmm. And that's a massive generalization, but in general, that seems to be the trend. And so I think that really is a huge bright spot for the industry.
Yeah. And that's fantastic. And I've been hearing a lot of this similar types of trends from other people that I talk to. I'm curious to know, and I don't know how much you can really answer this question, but I would be curious to just know your thoughts based on all the people you've talked to for your various articles. You mentioned, some of these bigger companies have been struggling over the past few years, and there's all this doom and gloom in the fashion industry. Companies are going bankrupt, retail's dying, all these various headlines that we just see over and over. And not that it's any excuse on any level to force someone to work for free or to absolutely pay them an unlivable wage. But how much do you think that some of this abuse is due to just general abuse and being a total just jerk and being abusive because they can, because there's so many people lined up to work in this industry. It's so competitive. People are dying for these jobs, versus these companies actually having real cash flow problems. And they're like, I can literally only afford to pay this much. Again, that's not an excuse to pay abusively low wages. But what do you see, or do you have any thoughts or opinions on that?
Yeah, I think that that this culture existed far longer than it's these problems have been around for a long time, even before the current retail apocalypse, as we're calling it, right? Yeah. It's just kind of how the industry has always worked. And I think that it's absolutely true that part of this was just a matter of the fact that it's an industry that's very glamorous, that a lot of people want to work in, and there's just like this excess of supply of eager young people who want to work here. I think that's really the problem, and that's also coupled with the fact that there are lots of other industries where there are lots of people who are eager to work. The tech industry being one of them. So it's not just that there's this excess demand for these jobs. It's also that the industry itself, like the leaders in the industry, weren't taking a stand and saying, we have all of this really amazing talent. We're going to be respectful of these young people and, create policies that ensure that their rights are protected. It was just that the industry didn't care and wasn't taking a stand on it. Yeah. So I really don't think it has much to do with the current retail apocalypse.
Yeah. It's just abuse in general, because there are so many people sort of lined up and willing to work for peanuts. I sometimes almost think, and not to blame it on us as designers, that's the role that I work in, but that on some level, like, it can become a self-perpetuating thing. And like you've said, the industry is shifting now because these millennials have put their foot down and said, no, we want a good work-life balance. We want a happy workplace. And so they put their foot down to do something about that. And then these companies that they've built and they're implementing that within their own companies. So it's great that these sort of new generations have initiated a big change.
Yeah, definitely.
So, okay, so kind of shifting gears into those startup companies, you write a ton of articles, like you mentioned, on some of the progressive brands that are new and that are doing really unique and fun stuff in this industry, and kind of breaking some of the molds and taking over a big portion of the fashion industry. What are you seeing in the past couple of years as far as trends in some of these startup fashion companies that's working? Like, what is it that you see within these small startup brands? There's so many designers out there that want to do something, that are trying to do something, and it's still very competitive. But what do you see that is working within all these various startups that you cover?
Well, I think that the Everlane effect is real. So, as most of your listeners, I'm sure know, Everlane launched several years ago with this concept of radical transparency. So they gave the consumer a glimpse into the factories where they were making their products. But not only that, they also gave their consumers insight into the pricing structure. So they were very honest about how much a garment costs to make and what they were selling it for, so that the consumer could be comfortable that they weren't overpaying, that they weren't paying just for a label.
Sure.
And so that was a great idea at the time. And what's really impressed me is that startups have basically accepted that as the status quo. So there's so many brands now that are launching, like Kuyana, like there's a bag company called Oliver Cabell, companies throughout, the fashion industry. That's just kind of how you have to do business now. So if you want to launch a startup, the consumer sort of expects you to tell us where you make your product. So like Mgemi, it's a shoe company out of New York. They give you a glimpse into the factories where they make their shoes in Italy. And there's also this element of, customers don't want to pay inflated prices anymore. For a long time, people cared about status, and so you would get a bag with like a big label on it, whether it was like Chanel or any one of these like luxury brands, and you were kind of okay with paying a lot of money for that brand name because it meant that you were getting good quality. And these days, that doesn't really apply anymore. Customers, they want to pay a fair amount for their product, and what that means is that they're willing to pay for good quality, and they're not willing to pay much more than that, right? Much more than what is reasonable. And so I think that trend is really, it's really impressive how one company has totally shifted the way that we think about buying products. But the other big trend that I'm seeing has to do, and it's related to this issue of transparency, but, I think that brands that are being very innovative about creating sustainable products are really winning. So one brand that's very well known for this is Reformation out in LA. And Reformation, is all about thinking about sustainability and making sure that, every product that they make is as sustainable as possible. You get a little report with information about the impact that garment has had on the environment. Mm-hmm. And so but in addition to that, the clothes themselves are really fun and sexy. They're not sort of like boring clothes for just like tree huggers, right? I mean, these are clothes that you'd want to buy and wear regardless. So brands like that are really changing the narrative, right, for other brands in the industry. I think that consumers care about the impact that fashion has on the environment, and brands that are coming up now have to sort of be more aware of the impact that their supply chain is having on the environment, and be able to tell their customer, that they're doing the best that they can, and that they're trying to protect the environment in every way possible.
Yeah. I love that. And so it's like not just this this consumer society that just wants this beautiful garment, but they want to really understand the story behind that product. They want to understand where it came from, why the cost is what it is, that it was made in an ethical and sustainable manner. And so it's like the consumer has shifted, and I don't know exactly how this happened. Everlane obviously had a big influence on this, but the consumer has shifted to really care a lot more about the product. They don't want just a beautiful item. They want to know the whole backstory behind it, which is such a cool transformation in this industry.
Yeah, definitely. And I think another big trend has been that, for a while, fast fashion was king. Yeah. And brands like H&M and Zara, and like Forever 21, all the way down to like Target, these were sort of the brands that young people were buying from. And definitely, like, even in my generation, I'm 34, in my 20s, that was the norm. And I think that there's sort of been a little bit of saturation in terms of like the impact that fast fashion has had. I think that people really got tired of collecting cheap clothes that that were disposable, essentially. And it's just, people decided that really it wasn't a good way to shop. It didn't lead to really good quality garments, and also once news sort of once people became more aware that fashion is an incredibly polluting industry, the second most polluting industry in the world by some estimates after the oil industry. I think that all of that basically, changed people's minds. And so consumers who were raised in a world of fast fashion, are beginning to think, okay, what do I want when it comes to buying a dress or something, or a shirt? I want to know where this came from. I want to know the story behind it. And I also want to buy something that will last a long time, that won't just end up in a landfill. And so I really think that all of that has just really changed the way that we approach clothing.
Yeah. And so in addition to sort of buying something to last, buying something that was made ethically or sustainably produced, understanding the seeing the transparency within the supply chain that these brands are now showing us, what are you seeing in terms of people buying? So outside of those aspects, what are you seeing in terms of people buying for beauty or people buying to actually solve a problem, and what some of these startup brands are offering? Is it just that they're doing these beautiful clothes and they are sustainable, they're transparent, and they're made well to last a while? Or are these brands that you're seeing kind of make it in the startup scene, is the product that they're introducing fit all of those, and they're also solving a problem, whether that be, and this could be a whole different conversation, but whether that be in the fashion tech space or whether it just be like this gap in the market that no one's filling. Are they being really creative on that level, or is it just beautiful clothing that happens to be sustainable, ethically made, and they're being transparent about it?
So, yeah, I think that all the things that we've talked about so far have to do with sort of the execution of the product. But in terms of the actual products themselves, I think that, I do think that there are lots of brands that are solving real problems, and those brands are winning. One example that I can think of is this brand that I just wrote about called Dagny Dover. It's a bag company started by three women about 3 or 4 years ago. And the bag industry is interesting, right? Because we see so many bags flooding the market every season. Brands like Coach, all the way down, through the marketplace, like Timbuktu and, all these different brands. They're just like pumping out tons and tons and tons of product every season. And yet so many women can't find bags that work for them. I mean, it's just this interesting issue because, and I write about this all the time where, because every year I do an annual review of the best work-life bags, is what we call them, just bags that are really functional and that are also beautiful. But women struggle to find one bag that can get them from the morning to the evening. And that's why when you stand on street corners in every major city, you see women going to work with like 3 bags. Like they have their beautiful, leather bag, their designer bag. Then they have like a tote bag with their like gym clothes in it, and then they have a separate bag for their lunch or their water bottle or whatever. And so basically, there were gaps in the market, right? Like there wasn't a company that was thinking thoughtfully about how a woman lives her life and what kind of bag she needs to get through the day. So these 3 women decided that they were going to fix this problem, and so they sat down and created very thoughtfully designed bags. And so these bags are, they're beautiful. They're made from leather and other materials, depending on the price point you want to pay. But they just have really, simple things that lots of other bags don't have. So the bags have like padded slots that are zippable for your laptop. They have a spot for you to put your water bottle that's like kind of a thermal case so that your water stays cold during the day. There's a ton of different pockets, and they're not just like blindly throwing pockets all over the place. There's like a spot where, that makes sense for like your phone. It's close to the top of the bag so your phone doesn't get lost like all the way at the bottom. There's a keychain in every single bag so that, you're not like there in the middle of the night, like digging through your purse for your keys. And So just talk about problem solving. I mean, it was just like all they had to do was sit down and think about, the problems they had with their bags. And the brand has been doing really well. It's been growing really fast. And, just producing like tons of, really innovative products. So that's the kind of thing where, clearly beauty is really important. And clearly having transparency in your supply chain, all of that is really, really important. But even though the fashion industry is so busy with so many companies, big and small, I think that a lot of the time, there are these like blind spots where companies are just not really addressing the needs of the consumer. And I think that brands that are thoughtfully designing products to meet these needs can still win.
Yeah. It's interesting because as much as it is such a saturated industry, like you said, there are still these holes. I mean, just speaking of bags, I searched, and this was while I was living in New York City, so I had access to pretty good shopping. I searched for 6 months to find a laptop bag that didn't look like a dorky laptop bag, but was actually like not just beautiful, but also like really functional. And I had some requirements that needed to work for me, but it took me a really long time to find it. So I think that even as much as there is so much saturation and so much competition, there are still these unique little niches and holes and gaps in the market that need to be filled and still have problems to be solved. And there's room for simple innovation. I mean, this is like you said with this product, they just put the pockets in the right place. Like they're not doing any fancy technology here. This is just really strategic thinking and engineering a good product.
Totally. And I see so many examples of this. In the workwear market, for a long time, it was really, really hard for women to find really high quality clothes that were thoughtfully designed. I mean, so on the one end of the market, there was like Theory, and brands like that were pretty expensive, very well made, but pretty expensive. And then on the lower end of the market, you were going to places like Ann Taylor and other brands like that. But lots of women were struggling to find pieces that they could afford that looked good and that had all of the qualities that they needed to sort of get through a work week. And so I'm seeing a lot of activity in this space just because there was such a big, wide open space here. So like a brand like MM Lafleur, which is also based out of New York, they basically created these pieces of clothing that were really just well designed. That they were designed to make the body look good. Their designer thinks a lot about how fabrics fall on the body, things like that. But there was also a focus on using fabrics that didn't wrinkle, so that when you went on a business trip, your clothes didn't just get totally wrinkled by the time you reached your destination. Most of the clothes are machine washable, so you don't have to spend, weeks out of the year taking your stuff to get dry cleaned. Just simple things like that. It was not like a huge cataclysmic shift in what they were doing. But these little things that they were doing to make sure that the clothes worked better for women have had a massive impact. And it's another brand that's doing really, really well.
Yeah, that's so great to hear that just some extra thought going into how the product's designed, why you chose that fabric, how does that really affect the end user, can have such a big impact and can put your brand on this completely different trajectory. It doesn't have to be this insanely crazy advancement or anything. It's just some thoughtfulness put into the initial design and selection of materials. I love that.
Yeah, and I'm also seeing this a lot in the lingerie and underwear market. That was another market that was ripe for disruption because the main, and still the biggest player in that market is Victoria's Secret. And Victoria's Secret is a very powerful brand. It produces a lot of the bras that America wears. But so, there are brands that are creating, better fitting products, brands like Third Love, that are just thinking a lot about design. But I think sometimes it's not just about the product itself, it's also how the brand is choosing to speak to the consumer. And so there's a brand like Lively, which is another startup that launched recently, partly, you know, they designed bras that fit comfortably, but part of what they were doing that was different was they were just talking to the consumer differently. So, you know, Victoria's Secret was always leading with sexuality, and you know, like you think about Victoria's Secret, and the big thing that they do is they have this fashion show with these like you know, of these naked women going on stage in this very glamorous show with all these like angels or Victoria's Secret angels. Totally. But, you know, Lively said, you know, what if we created bras that weren't sort of, what if we spoke to the consumer in language that wasn't infused with sexuality? What if we talked about comfort and empowerment and, you know, feeling good in your own body? Like, what if that was the message? And so they've gone out with like a very different kind of like approach to talking about bras. And it's not to say that sexiness isn't part of the discussion, but it's basically like the gaze has shifted, right? So it's not like you're not looking sexy because a man thinks that you're sexy. You're choosing to be sexy because sexiness is something that, you know, is basically, it's like, it's for yourself, right? Like, feeling good about your body, you know, and feeling sexually alive. Like, that's not necessarily something you need to do for a man. And that shift in language has been so attractive to a whole generation of younger consumers, I think. Yeah. And so I think that brand has done well just by talking about the product differently.
Yeah. Okay. So that's great. I mean, again, like little simple things. I don't know about you, but I can't look at like a runway show of these angels and feel like that's not very relatable for me as a consumer. Like, that's not me. That's not what I look like. It's just, I don't really connect with that. But comfort and empowerment, I mean, those are all things that are very attractive and do connect with me. And so I think, like you said, just some of these simple shifts in the thoughtfulness of how the product's designed, and then how you actually package that up and present it to your audience and market it, the dialogue that you have and the words and the conversation that you choose to have with your audience can have an insane impact. So I love those two really, really simple things. So taking it somewhere a little bit more advanced, a little bit less simple, what are you seeing in the fashion tech space that's working over the past couple years?
So fashion tech meaning how, like the actual products, or in how they're being sold, like digital technology?
I would say more in the product. So, for example, I interviewed recently Billie Whitehouse, who just launched her Naughty X line, which is a yoga legging that's got, I don't know the technology inside of it, to be honest. So I might, mess up on the words here, but it's got some technology built into it that gives you subtle cues as you go through your yoga practice to just help adjust and align your body a little bit better. So if you're practicing at home and you're going along to a video or something, it just gives you these subtle like pulses throughout the legging. And she feels very strongly, I'll be totally transparent, fashion tech is not a space I really keep up on, and I really have a pulse on, but, she and I chatted, and she feels very confident that, fashion is just the next space for our clothes to become smart. In 20 years from now, like all of our clothes are going to be smart. And so I'm curious to know, on the technology side, like technology that's actually built into the product, what are you seeing? I mean, I think it started out, years back with a lot of wrist type of stuff, like watches and bracelets and jewelry. But now some of these brands are building it actually into the product. And so I don't know, how many brands you've talked to or how many brands you've covered within your writing that are doing something on the fashion tech side, and what your thoughts are and how that's changed over the past 2 years and what you see maybe coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, I think I wrote a little story about those yoga pants. I thought that that was so interesting. But honestly, I do feel like this is it's kind of early days yet in the world of technology in fashion. So what I would say is that I think what we are seeing a lot of is a lot of really great fabric innovation. So a lot of technology, thanks in part to the athleisure movement. So all these brands that were working really hard to develop fabrics that were great for sports, all of that innovation is now entering the mainstream clothing market. So, like for a while, like Lululemon was kind of, and other brands like that were at the cutting edge of coming up with clothes that were moisture wicking and that had all kinds of interesting ventilation and that were exceedingly comfortable and that were also machine washable, things like that. What I think is really cool is that all kinds of brands are now incorporating those technologies into their clothing. So this company called Project Gravitas, it's a women's workwear brand. They recently launched a collection of work clothes, so like shift dresses and wrap dresses that use fabric that would ordinarily be in in like yoga pants, basically. So these clothes are extremely comfortable. They're moisture wicking, so you can get through like a really hot day in New York without sweating and like without feeling gross at the end of the day, things like that. So that's one level of fabric innovation. And there are other interesting things that are happening, like fabrics that are moisture or temperature regulating. So there are more and more companies that are coming up with garments that basically keep you cool when your body is heating up and keep you warm when the temperature drops outside. Really cool technologies that are doing that kind of thing. But in terms of like essentially like wearable tech, so as you were saying, the things that were originally like found on wrists. I think that we're still sort of in early days there. I've seen a couple of interesting examples of this at work. There's a jacket that Levi's recently put out that it made in conjunction with Google. That's like an interesting application of wearable technology. So what happens is you wear this jacket, and at your wrist there's a little button that you can tap. And the idea is that it's for commuters. So it's for people who get to work on their bicycle. And it's a denim jacket that looks just like any other denim jacket that Levi's would make. But what it does is that as you're going along on your bike path, it gives you instructions about where you're supposed to go. So it works in conjunction with your phone, so that if you're supposed to go right or left, it basically signals that to you, so you don't have to take out your phone when you're biking to figure out where you're supposed to go. Now that I think is an interesting application of the technology, because I think part of the problem is that we're beginning to see various types of technology, but we don't know exactly the best application for them. There's no point in just like incorporating technology for technology's sake, right?
Right.
So in this case, what I liked about this was that this is actually solving a problem. There are lots of people in places like San Francisco who bike everywhere and who have trouble figuring out where to go and have to take out their phones. This is solving that problem for them. But there are lots of examples of technology that's being incorporated into garments that like basically it's hard for me to understand whether it's like really that necessary. Like there was this one jacket that I saw that basically can make you feel like you're being hugged if you're having a bad day. I don't know if that's necessarily something that everybody really wants out of their high-tech jacket. But yeah, I think we're at like the first wave, right? Like with all the technologies being developed, and I think we're slowly beginning to see how it can be applied. And I think there's so much room for new designers to try and figure out how to use these new technologies in ways that actually serve a need.
Yeah, it's an interesting space, and I think it's one that can very easily become gimmicky, or just like you said, technology for technology's sake, versus again going back to that, being really, really thoughtful about what you're designing, and does this really serve the end customer, and how does this benefit them, and is this something really functional for them, versus am I just doing it for technology's sake?
Yeah, totally. Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Really, really cool. And some really fun insights on everything that's going on in the industry. Liz, super, super great to chat with you. I would love to end with the question that I ask everybody at the end of the interview. And that is, what is one thing nobody ever asked you about and I'll say this, writing about the fashion industry as opposed to working in the fashion industry. So what is one thing that nobody ever asked you about writing about the fashion industry that you wish they did ask you?
I think one thing, so, what people always ask me is like, how do you like Fashion Week? And people are always interested in like that part of what I do. And it's true. I do attend Fashion Week. I do, sometimes go to these shows. But the thing that I actually care about, I'm interested in brands that also care about this, is brands that are really trying to serve the rest of the country, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in, the up and coming like hippest brands that are out there, but I'm also interested in what brands like Walmart are doing, right? Or like brands like Amazon are doing in the fashion space, because really, what's interesting to me about fashion is not beautiful clothes. What's interesting to me about fashion is that it's really tied into culture, and it's tied into, the fabric, not to use a pun here, but into the fabric of our everyday lives, right? I'm interested in how fashion, has to do with how we represent ourselves, self-representation. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in how the fashion industry is, impacts like global supply chains, and how, the fashion industry changes, and how we approach the fashion industry could change how polluting the industry is. Yeah. And so to me, all of those questions, they're far more relevant when we're talking about, the swath of American consumers that are like kind of in the middle of the country, and not just like what's going on in Fashion Week. So to me, like, what I wish people would ask me is not like, oh, what do you think about, like this year's New York Fashion Week? I would much rather be asked a question about like, what is some person like in the middle of Florida or Nebraska, like what is their relationship with fashion? Because I think that question actually has a far more interesting answer.
That's so interesting that you say that, because I've talked to many designers in New York City who are like absolutely terrified to leave New York City because they feel like there's no fashion anywhere else. I mean, they work in the industry and it's maybe because they were born and raised there and that's all they know. But they're like terrified to leave New York City, that like, oh my gosh, there's no fashion going on anywhere else. And there are so many brands and so many companies. And of course, obviously all these people, everybody has to wear clothes that are located in all these other places. So I love that you bring up the relevance of that, and that it's not just about Fashion Week and what's going on in New York City, but it's about what's going on in the middle of the country too.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways that consumer is far more important, because that is the average consumer, and that's the person who's going to be ensuring that your brand sticks around. So that's who I want people to pay attention to.
Yeah, fantastic. I love that. Great, Liz. Can you please share with everybody where they can find you online?
Sure. Find me on Twitter at Liv Secret. That's my handle. But also sign up for my weekly newsletter. It's called Moving the Needle. You can find a link to where to sign up right on my Twitter page. It's pinned there.
Awesome.
So definitely connect with me.
Awesome. And I will put a link to that in the show notes for everybody to connect. This was so much fun chatting with you. I really appreciate your time and everything that you have to share with us today. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
If you'd like to learn more about any of the resources mentioned in today's episode, visit the show notes at sfdnetwork.com/26. And since you made it this far, you must have liked the episode. Did you know that the best way you can say thank you and give back is by subscribing and reviewing the show on iTunes? It only takes 60 seconds, but this small effort really helps the show grow and get discovered by new listeners. Visit sfdnetwork.com/subscribe to do that now. I'd really appreciate it, and thanks as always for your support.